into marriage with 2 children immediately. They were flower girls in our wedding. And about a week before the wedding, we found out we were going to be able to adopt them. So it was this really sweet time of God bringing us together as a family, quite literally as you could get. That here, God had given the girls a mom, and we were able to talk about Greg, my husband, and say, you have Mommy Julie, and now you're going to have Daddy Greg, or they called him Daddy Deg. We even got him a T-shirt that said Daddy Deg on it. And we talked about how, this is how God's bringing us together as a family. So he's bringing you a mommy, he's bringing you a daddy. And at the time, our 5-year-old daughter piped up and said, yeah, and God knew you needed kids. Yeah, I guess God knew we needed kids within the first 5 minutes of marriage. So this was a process of beginning to think our family life didn't start out in a normal, typical way. And how were we going to talk about it? We were foster parents. We were in a system where we very much were in some ways told how we were supposed to parent and how we couldn't parent. And so in many ways, what I'm about to talk about this morning became personal because we had to learn to do family life very differently than any formula or any ideas I had growing up about what typical life is like, how I could parent, how I could discipline. So I began thinking this through and say, what does it look like to parent 2 children that are not yet ours? And what does it look like when you're bringing a family together? And even how do we talk about, so I said last night about we are responsible to be faithful in the way we tell our children's stories. So let me backtrack a minute and say, when I was talking to the girls about us coming together as a family and the wedding and things like that, at some point, the girls had been in foster care. They had probably been in over 4 or 5 different placements before the age of 2 and 3 years old. So how do you tell that story? How do you point to Christ or the author of your story in the midst of it? And we would talk about how, God knew we weren't ready to be your mommy and daddy yet. So he brought you other mommies and daddies to take care of you until we were ready to be your mommy and daddy. And here God's bringing us together. Now there's something developmentally appropriate, factually accurate, and it's redemptive. I'm pointing to the author of their story, right? So I'm not negating that there are hard things in their story, but I'm helping to define their story and retell their story in ways that point them to Christ. And that's really important. And as they get older, more details arise. And developmentally, we share more information and we help them become more aware. But we're always speaking in a way that points them back to the author of their story. So as I'm saying this, one of our daughters asked, she said, well, how come we had so many mommies and daddies anyway? And that's when we began talking about how God knew you from the moment you were formed in your mother's womb. And he knew, again, it went back to we weren't ready to be your mommy and daddy yet. He brought you other mommies and daddies to take care of you until we were ready. And this is how God brought us together as a family. Now, the interesting thing is, as our family grew through adoption, this story began the story that they were telling the other kids. So within the first year of marriage, all of a sudden, we had 2 little brothers who came. So my poor husband went from being a single bachelor to a husband, a homeowner, and a father of 4 within the first year of marriage. So imagine the stress level that we were under at some points. But what was a really sweet time was when one of my daughters was sitting in the living room with these 2 little boys saying this: Mommy and Daddy weren't ready to be your mommy and daddy yet, so they brought you other mommies and daddies to take care of you until you were ready to be a part of our family. And so now you have a mommy and a daddy and you've got sisters. And in his little squeaky voice, one of the boys goes, well, what in the world took you so long? So there you see that when you and I become really good at telling their stories in a way that makes sense, in a way that are accurate, but in a way that point to hope in Christ, they begin retelling their own story. They not only heard that, she had received it, she had embraced it, and now she was speaking into somebody else's life as well. And that's the neat thing when you begin thinking about the author of the story and how he's faithful in writing the story. So let's talk about what it looks like to be an expert. This isn't transitioning. To be an expert at knowing your own family. There we go. The first thing I'd say is, how do we commit to understanding your child well or our kids well? I love this Proverbs that says, the purposes of a man's heart are like deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. So what does it mean? It means we're called to be deep thinkers. We're called to be wise and to draw our children out, to draw our family out. And so too often, we become really good at knowing parenting philosophies or parenting approaches, and again, we become very formulaic. We just try to put our kids in that box and parent them that way, instead of saying, Lord, what does it look like to wisely know each of my kids and what their needs are and what their struggles are and what their temptations or their skills and gifting are and how I nurture those things? What does it look like to know them well? I love this quote. It says, we could learn a lot from crayons. Some are sharp, some are pretty dull, some have weird names, and all are different colors, but they all have to live in the same box. Isn't that like your family sometimes? All different, all creative, all different strengths and weaknesses, and we're all called to live together in one unique family system. And how do we do that well? Well, we are called to be the leaders. We're called to shepherd our kids and know how to do that. So here's another way I like to think of it. I'm going to give you guys a lot of pictures today, partly because that's the way my brain works, and partly because I think it's really helpful in thinking through kids. From a counseling standpoint, when I have parents or families come in and meet with me and talk about their kids, one of the things I say is, my job is to try to look at your child as a puzzle and think of putting a puzzle out on the table before you. How do you usually start understanding the puzzle or putting the picture together? We're all different in the way we do it, right? Some just start digging in. Most of us would work from the outside and work our way in. We find out what the parameters are, and we start to build pieces. Sometimes you and I pick up two pieces, and we fit them together and go, oh, this makes perfect sense to me. Only to later find out that we find another piece of the puzzle that better fits and better suits. And so you pull it out and go, I thought these two were connected, but they're actually really not. And we pull them apart, and we connect the pieces better. Parenting is a lot like that, isn't it? Your kids are growing and maturing and developing, and we think we understand them, and we think we know what's going on until they prove us wrong, or later on we find out, oh, this was really what was going on for them. In, I think it's Shepherding a Child's Heart or Age of Opportunity, Paul Tripp talks about our kids and says that they are worshipers, they're revelation receivers, and they're interpreters. And that's true of all of us, isn't it? It's kind of a biblical framework for understanding us. We're meaning makers, we're revelation receivers, we're interpreters, we're worshipers. We're always serving something. The question is, what are we serving? So years ago, when one of our sons was really little, he came home from school, and Andrew's quite a talker. I'll probably share another example of him in a minute, but quite a talker. He's a verbal processor, so whatever is going on inside, you know it. It's coming out of his mouth at all times. So he happened to come home one day from school, and he had a headache. And he's very expressive, and he goes, Mom, why do I have a headache? I don't know, honey. I don't know why you have a headache, but I'll give you some medicine, and I'll make you feel better. Probably less than 10 minutes, he comes in and goes, I don't feel better. Why do I have a headache? I still have a headache. I don't know, Andrew. Why don't you have some water, have a snack? 5 minutes later, he comes back, and I still have a headache. All right, well, why don't you go lay down on the couch? I'll put a cartoon on for you. And he's literally following me from room to room around the house, telling me, I still have a headache. Why do I have a headache? I still have a headache. I still have a headache. Till eventually, I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. You've got a headache. I can't help you. And he walks away. A few minutes later, I'm in the kitchen. He comes walking in, and he goes, Mom, I know why I have a headache. And I half laughed. I said, okay, why do you have a headache? As if that should help him at all. I don't know why knowing why you have a headache helps you, but he said, because my brain is growing, but my head's not. Isn't that brilliant? I just started laughing, and I said, your brain is growing, but your head's not? He goes, yeah. I said, okay, well, that would give me a headache too. And he walked away, he didn't do this, but in his mind, it was kind of like, problem solved. I knew I have a headache. Isn't that interesting that all he wanted was to make sense of why he had a headache, which I can't imagine it made the headache go away, but that's the way he worked. If he can figure out the whys to something, then he feels better about it. And you know what? He is 14 now. That's still how his brain works. And the poor guy, I joke with him. He knows I tell the story, but I joke that he's 14. He probably still thinks that's why he gets headaches, because I never corrected him. And he said the other day, I told this story probably in the last year, and he goes, "Mom, I know that's not why you get headaches now." Okay, good to know. But that's what our kids do, right? They're always making sense out of their experiences, and they do it so many times a day that you and I miss that on a regular basis. They are making sense out of why people act the way they do, and why mom and dad are too busy or aren't too busy, or why we make the rules we do. They're always making sense out of things. The question is, are they doing it accurately? And are they doing it without any loving guidance? And our young people today are growing up with parents speaking less and less into their lives, and the world speaking more and more, and their peer groups speaking more and more into their lives. And if you and I are silent, somebody else will step in and they will speak loudly. And that's so important for us to realize, that we have got to make the most of every opportunity to try to speak to them. It was so neat to see what those kids were saying, and in some ways it brought tears to my eyes, because I could think, well, what would my kids be saying if we asked that question? We all need to grow in this. There feels like there's not enough time in the day to do it. What I would say, though, it's never too late either. I don't care how old your kids are, it's never too late to show you care, right? It's never too late to say, I love you, I want to understand and know you better, or to apologize for the mistakes we've made. And to say, you are somebody I want to know and understand well. And so you take this puzzle and you say, how do I understand them? And as kids grow and develop, the pieces fit in better and better. Again, take a child who has disabilities, and you're trying to understand where their strengths and weaknesses, or kids who are maybe more challenging or are willful or determined, strong-willed, as we like to say. And when are we tempted to see everything through that lens and not see that there might be deep anxiety or fear underneath that, or insecurity underneath it? But when you think in terms of a puzzle, you can say all those things can exist together. It's just how they fit and how we piece them together, and that our kids are not simplistic, they're complicated. They have their own unique personalities that we're trying to understand. Tell another story about Andrew. Again, Andrew's our logical kid, and even just recently, he was talking to me. I was picking him up from a wrestling practice one day, and as we're driving, somehow we got onto talking about his siblings. And he was informing me how I was a little clueless to what was going on with some of his siblings and what they did. And I said, oh, really? Well, inform me, Andrew. And that's always good information to get, right? But as he began talking, it was really interesting to hear the things he was saying that he thought I didn't know or understand about them were actually things I did know about them. And he thought they were getting away with things behind our backs, or he thought we didn't know what they did at school. And so as he's talking, I started off saying, I just want to hear what he has to say. Maybe there are things I'm missing. And as he's talking, it was actually really encouraging to go, this is interesting. These are things actually we've even spoken into our kids' lives about. And here he is saying, I don't think you know what's really going on. And I began thinking about that and going, why is it? Why is it that he thinks we don't understand when we do understand? And that's a great question to ask. Is it that we're not speaking clearly enough? Is it just the way that they see the world? Is it that they have something to offer that we really are missing? All really good questions. So I look back at that and think I really appreciated that car ride, because it made me start thinking about many things. What do I miss? What do my kids see I don't see? But then it affirmed what are things I really did know. And it was pretty fun by the end of it, because I said, okay, Andrew, so you're thinking I'm missing out on these things, but let me tell you, I do know some of this. And I began repeating some things back. And then I said, and let's talk about you for a minute. Let's see if I have a good picture of you. And I began talking about some of his strengths and how he's a verbal processor. And Andrew, you like to be really logical, don't you? And he kind of half smiled. And I said, and you like a good debate. So I can say something like, Andrew, go upstairs and get this for me. And he can somehow debate the language I used about, you don't go up, you really are going down, or you really are doing this or that. And by the end of the conversation, you're totally exasperated because you're saying, Andrew, you know what I'm talking about, just go do it, will you? And I could look at that and say, you're being defiant, or you're trying to be frustrating or annoying, or whatever language you want to use. And sometimes I think he is, and sometimes it is just that's how he's wired. He will debate any kind of language or any kind of tweaking of what's being said because his brain works that way. So when, as a parent, do I just say, this is the way he is, he's not trying to be frustrating, or he's not trying to be argumentative, and when do I look at it and hold a mirror back to him and say, Andrew, I know this is fun for you, but it's not always fun when you're on the other side of it, right? It's not always fun debating somebody who always is nitpicking at the way you word things. And what I'm doing is I'm helping him understand himself, and I'm helping him understand how people might perceive how he is. That's part of what really thoughtful parenting does, is it makes you and I be more aware of our children's strengths and weaknesses, and we tend to be more gracious in understanding their motives, or we tend to speak into their motives when we know they're not good. But we always take it a step further, because our goal is to help them know themselves well before the Lord. Our goal is to help point them to, in what ways do you need help? In what ways do you need Christ to intervene in your life? Or in what ways do you need to understand that the way you treat other people aren't loving? And so as our conversation went on, I started talking about the way that he's gifted and his strengths, and I started talking about, and here's problems I think you struggle with, and you know what, I think humility is kind of an issue in your life. And he's back there with a smile increasing on his face, and I said, so how am I doing so far? And he goes, not bad, I guess. But, and then he goes off to argue about a minor detail I talked to him about. But that's part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, what does it look like to know each? And multiply that by the children you have. Does that sound exhausting to you? It does. Which, by the way, is why I think we tend to want to go towards the formulaic parenting, because it's easy, everybody fits in the same box. Where what I'm arguing is really a wisdom approach that says we are wired a certain way. And there's something very freeing and liberating about that, because what it means is my family doesn't have to be like your family. Your family does not have to be like my family. I don't have to judge how you're parenting versus how I'm parenting, because all I'm called to is, who did God give me, and what are their weaknesses and strengths, and how am I called to love them well? Which is why when it comes to rules, everybody shouldn't have the same rules. And when it comes to bedtimes and homework and certain kind of privileges, there should be liberty in the way families do it differently. Because if you're becoming really wise at knowing your own home, you're going to apply it to the responsibility and the maturity of the child. So one of the typical things we hear from our kids all the time is, it's not fair. Anybody else hear that? It's not fair, which means you're letting them do something I want to do, is usually what it means. And what my husband is notorious for saying is, we don't do fair. We do what is helpful and right for each of you. And what we mean by that is, if you're mature and you're responsible, then you get a privilege that you can handle. And if you're not mature and responsible, then you don't get that privilege until you can be mature and responsible. And it's not done in a punitive way, hopefully, but in a way that helps them understand it's on your lap. What you decide to do will determine whether you can handle this privilege or this ability level. And technology is one of those typical places, right? Where we shouldn't be coming up with rules at this age kids should have or shouldn't have a cell phone, or should or shouldn't be able to play games. You really need to be wise and say what's helpful and good for each child, or for my family, for that matter. Let me give you another picture. So here's another way to think about it, that we want to know kids as individuals, but we have to know a biblical worldview on how to think of this, that we're all image bearers. We're all made to bear the image of Christ and redeemed in Christ. We also have fallen human natures. We sin, we struggle. And then you see the things on the side, that the situational, let's start with that. That's on this side. Personal history, experiences, sufferings, or blessings. So again, this is where we're all different, right? The experiences I've gone through in life are very different than the experiences you've gone through. How do I understand the hard things God's allowed in our life, the blessings he's allowed, the situations, the people? And there's the creational, which we're going to talk about in a minute, the strengths, the weaknesses of the individual, their limitations, where do they have aptitudes and where do they have disabilities? Here's another way of saying it. One of my colleagues, Mike Emlett, who has written many books, gives this picture, this triangle of a biblical view of all of us, that we're sinners, we're sufferers, and we're saints. So there's a picture of us all, that we all are image bearers. We all struggle with suffering in this world. We all experience living in a fallen, broken world where there is both hardship and illness and sicknesses and grief and sufferings. And then we're moral responders. We decide how we're going to choose in godly or ungodly ways, right? So when I talk about this, one of the things I talk about is, but then in the center of the triangle is the individual. And that's where we will all be different and uniquely wired. So we all have the same makeup externally, I meaning biblically, our framework for how we think of our children. But then you look at your children each as individuals inside. And we could list many things. I've listed a couple, just temperament. Don't you often hear some kids come out of the womb screaming, and others come out as passive and placid as they possibly can be, and others come out silly or wired or high-strung? That we know our children are not born blank slates, that the Lord has given them temperaments, and he's given them unique ways of expressing themselves. Strengths, weakness, giftedness, aptitudes, disabilities. I'll give you a personal example. I'll never forget my parents telling this story about me, that I tend to be somebody who is for the underdog. And if you knew me better, this would not be a surprise to you, which is probably why we've done foster care and adopted and have way too many pets, because I've never met a stray animal I haven't wanted to bring home and taken care of. When I was kindergarten or first grade, my parents wanted to throw a birthday party for me. And they said, Julie, who do you want to invite? So I started naming off people I wanted to invite to my birthday party. And my mom said, well, these kids aren't your friends. What about your friends? And I said, well, these kids don't have any friends. I want to invite them. Doesn't that sound sweet? Was it because I was such a godly, mature 6-year-old? I'd argue no. We look at that and we assume godliness, where I'm saying that's just temperament. Temperamentally, from the time I was little, it was who's the underdog, who needs a friend. Anytime a stray animal showed up at our porch, I was sobbing hysterically, please let us keep the cat, please let us keep the llama, please let us keep the dog. That was innately who I was wired to be. And we can rightly or wrongly assume that's godly or ungodly, right? We can look at strong-willed personalities and see ungodly because it's unsanctified. We can look at temperaments like that and assume godly when it could be really sinful or unhealthy as well. So it's understanding our children and then seeing them in light of what Scripture says and in light of a biblical worldview, and helping them make sense out of themselves. So even as you're thinking about it, my guess is some of you can look at this, whether it's your children or your grandchildren or your nieces and nephews, and say, yeah, I can see how very different they are, or I can see how important it is to put the pieces together. Here's another way of talking about what I just said. You have two things that we often confuse, character and temperament, right? So we look at temperament, and that could be things like being independent or dependent. Does your child tend to be more independent worker or more viciously independent and getting ready in the morning and doing their own things, or they tend to be more dependent, more extroverted or introverted? Which, by the way, the world tends to have very strong feelings about which are better, right? We tend to think of extroverted as more of a leader and stronger and a better personality. And there's lots of good literature out there to say that it all depends on how you use those things. We tend to see our kids as loud or quiet, as a leader or follower, or aggressive, more aggressive, or passive. Then you have things that we know to be character. So temperament tend to be innate qualities that we see in our children. Then you have character issues like patience and kindness and honesty and integrity and a good work ethic. Those are all developed traits. So I just gave the example of myself a little while ago, where I naturally was kind of a more sensitive child, had more empathy, strong sense of empathy, which is a good gifting when it's used to love other people well, and it's a downfall when it becomes really self-centered. So very quickly, that sensitivity and empathy could be seen as a character issue when it's really a temperament issue. Is everybody tracking with me so far? Or things like, I put down here, empathy, attentiveness, aggressiveness, memory problems, organization. We tend to look at memory problems or organization sometimes as a character issue, instead of realizing that these are, going back to that triangle, they're the strengths and weaknesses of a child. They can be innate, but here's the thing. Innate qualities don't automatically become ambivalent. They're not amoral. We decide whether we're going to be godly or ungodly in the way we use them, right? So say a child is just incredibly disorganized, and I'm sure many of you have a child like that where you walk in their room and it looks like a cyclone hit. And no matter how many times you have them clean it, or no matter how many times you go in and clean it for them, within 10 minutes it's back to the way it looked 10 minutes ago. There is probably an innate just weakness, or that's how they're wired, that they're just not very organized. And then you have the child who's so meticulous that they are tempted to have fits of anger if you were to touch anything on their dresser. They want everything methodical and in its place because that's how they are wired, and they want their world to be in control, and everything has to be the way it has to be. Is one better than the other? If we were honest, we tend to say, yeah, I think this organized child's better than this disorganized child, right? And I'd argue no. Actually, it's what you choose to do with it. Because over here, if my world is managed by control and by keeping everything in place, and I don't deal with disorganization well, then I tend to get angry and frustrated at people that get in my way or mess up my room, and I don't love my siblings because I see them as an annoyance and a suffering in my life rather than a blessing. And over here, you can have an incredibly disorganized child, but they're giving and kind and loving, and they let everybody in their room because now they can blame it on them why their room's messy, right? Here's my point, though. My point is, no matter which way you go, there's strengths and weaknesses in those that have to be shepherded. You take a child maybe who has ADD and struggles with attention or memory problems or organization. That is inherently a weakness or struggle for them, but then they have a choice in how they manage it, right? We all have strengths and weaknesses. The question is, am I aware of my strengths and weaknesses? Have we taught our kids to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses in ways that they learn to compensate? So I will never be able to read a map. I mean, some piece of my brain is missing where I am so thankful when GPSs came out and the little apps, Google Maps came out, because what it means is all I have to do is listen to which way you tell me to drive, and I don't have to think or read a map. I would be the world's worst air traffic control person. I'd be crashing airplanes left and right. I kid you not. But you know what? That's a piece of my life that hardly anybody would know because I don't rely on it for anything. However, if that weakness was impeding my day-to-day work, that would be a problem. If that weakness was impeding relationships or impeding my job, you see how it can make children feel like failures, or it can make children just give up. And this is true in school settings, right? When kids struggle with learning issues, or they struggle with things that for 6 hours a day they're forced to focus on, that we start to see behavior problems, or we see passivity, or we see avoidance type issues because it's a significant weakness. So what does it look like to love them and help them through that, while also help them learn to compensate or help them learn to make good choices? So it's not that we don't have weaknesses, it's what we choose to do with them that matters. So if I'm a forgetful person, and I acknowledge I'm a forgetful person, I have two choices there. I can expect the world to adapt to me and say, well, you just know that about me, so you should expect me to be 20 minutes late, or you should expect me not to remember to do something for you. Or I can say, I know I'm a forgetful person, so I need to set timers on my cell phone, or I need to have people remind me, or I do things to compensate. That then becomes a character issue, right? Where I accept my weakness, but now I make the character choices to try to compensate, and I make the character choices to make sure I don't hurt other people with my forgetfulness. So this is why I want to hear me say that being an expert at knowing your kids means we still have to shepherd them, we still have to teach them to be responsible, even in the midst of things that aren't moral issues. But it can become a moral issue. Something that is a temperamental strength or weakness can become a character trait. And this is true with gifts as well. So kids that are really gifted academically, can they become arrogant and prideful in their gifting? Absolutely. So here's where it's not so cut and dry that it's only character, it's only temperament. It's learning that those things merge together. And it goes back to, I think I might mention this last night, that in our weakness, he is strong. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. I think of my failures in parenting, or my failures in counseling, or my failures in loving other people well. And when I am striving to love the Lord and be used of him, that he can take even my weaknesses and do something with them. As a matter of fact, his strength's made perfect in them. But when I am living for Julie, and I am living a very self-centered life, even my strengths become grave weaknesses. And so it's helping our families understand, helping our children understand that their strengths and weaknesses can be a blessing or a curse depending whose hand they're in. Are they in my hand or are they in the hands of the Lord? Here's another way of thinking about this. So, like I said, children are always interpreters. And you take a child in middle school who may be struggling with peer pressure, bullying, anxiety issues. That's the things of the world, the brokenness of the world coming at them. And how might they interpret those things? So up on the screen, I put some options of how we might process it. They might feel like they're helpless, that the world's not safe, that they have to protect themselves. All these things up here, God doesn't care, it's not okay to be different. If I'm different, people will mock me or make fun of me. Children will always be making sense of their experiences on a regular basis. The question is, do you and I take the time to know what's going on inside? Do you and I ask the questions that draw out that this is what they're thinking and feeling? Because until we do that, we can't speak into their lives well. We can't offer hope or the gospel well if we don't do that. So imagine if this is the way a child is interpreting the world around them, how are they going to begin to act? Think about that for a minute. If this is how they view the world, how might you expect a young person to behave? What will their behaviors or actions start to look like? Here are some examples. If I think I'm helpless, then I rely on others to tell me what to do, my peer group to tell me what to do. If the world doesn't feel safe, then either I'm fearful all the time or I'm trying to control it myself, right? If I feel I have to protect myself, then I push people away before they can hurt me. Again, you guys can read this. You don't need me to read all of it to you, but look at all the things, the ways a child might act out based on their interpretation about life. And then what do we tend to do as adults? We tend to either discipline or try to correct that external behavior because we know it's unhealthy or unhelpful, but we've never gotten to what's going on in the heart. We've never stopped and found out what they're believing and thinking that's caused them to act the way they do. And it doesn't mean we don't address behavior, but what it means is the behavior itself is not the issue. I just don't want outward compliance in my children. I want them to understand themselves. I want them to turn to Christ. I want them to know their own hearts in ways that will change the behavior from the inside out. Another way of saying this is when children learn to find identity in Christ, it doesn't negate the fact that they're going to struggle and face some of these things, but it starts to create this grid through which we understand and through which they understand and make sense of their experiences and make sense accurately. So it goes back to understanding that their story is in the midst of God's story, that they can only make sense out of their experiences accurately if we're helping point them to a God who makes sense out of their experiences. Going back to seeing Scripture as a story, from Genesis to Revelation, there's a story being told, God's people, a story of God's people and the way he deals with God's people and the way he loves them. You and I are embedded in the midst of that story. Our children are embedded in the midst of their story. I hope you can hear as I'm talking that it's a very different way of applying the Bible to their life. I shouldn't say very different, but it's different than a lot of what we do at times, where we want to make Christ relevant. We want to make Scripture relevant. And that when we slow down enough and we think about some of the stories in Scripture, whether it's the story of David or the story of Esther, that you and I can see ourselves in those people. People have not changed. Their fears, their insecurities, they're not trusting God. I mean, think of how many times God visibly did miracles in front of them, yet 5 days later they're grumbling in the wilderness. Or weeks later they've forgotten what God had done for them. We get that. We are very much like that. And so helping children be able to find themselves in the midst of that story and to be able to identify and say, yeah, they were a lot like us. These were not some kind of superheroes in the Bible. They were normal people who were broken, who failed, who made mistakes, and who struggled trusting a God that was performing miracles right in front of their faces. Well, if people who were seeing miracles, burning bushes, and the Red Seas opening before them were doubting God, can you and I understand why our children doubt God sometimes? Or why they struggle to see God at work in their lives? Absolutely. But then again, conversations and engaging them and talking to them thoughtfully in ways that point them to asking God to become more real and relevant in their life. That's our goal. So here's a slide I had last night. It's far better to be proactive than reactive. Going back to what I said. So what that means is I'm not waiting for my children to struggle, though they will, and you'll have multiple opportunities to deal with their struggles. But I'm becoming really thoughtful and wise and saying what's going on in their world, and I'm trying to speak into it. That, again, I'm making the most of every opportunity. And as I said last night, those car rides when they're stuck with you for long periods of time is a great example of just bringing up conversations and asking really good questions about how they think and see the world, and asking the Lord to give you moments of opportunity to speak to them. Again, another great quote, I can't figure out where it came from, but it wasn't me. It said, "The skill is to listen, the gift is to hear." Think about that. The skill is to listen, the gift is to hear. Ever been in a conversation with somebody where you know that they're just waiting for you to stop talking so they can jump in with what they want to say? You know you're not really being listened to, or they're not really hearing you because they're just waiting for you to be quiet so they can get their agenda or their point out. It makes a big, big difference when our kids tell that we're really listening to them, that we're really trying to understand them and know them, and we're not just trying to tell them why they're wrong about how they're thinking. That we need to really develop the gift of hearing our kids and how they think. Here's a really simple way of saying it. Talk often, talk freely, talk soon. Talk often, talk freely, talk soon. So again, this is going back to a principle last night that I want to talk often. I always want to be engaged in conversation. So if nothing else, my kids are hopefully hearing that I enjoy them, that I want to talk to them, that I want to know what they're thinking. Talk freely. Very early on, one of our goals was we would talk to all of our kids together about hard stuff because we wanted to foster a conversation that they all heard. We wanted for all of them to know that these are things we can talk about. And then talk soon. My experience is we wait way too long to talk to our kids about hard subjects. And why do we do this? I would say a lot of times it's fear, that our parenting is driven by the fear that if I talk about it, then they're going to be tempted to do these bad things. Instead of if I talk to them about it and I shape the way they think about it, they are more likely to avoid temptation or to know how to think when temptation comes their way. So one of the things I hear parents say all the time in counseling is when I ask, have you ever talked to your kids about this, whether it's death and dying or issues of sexuality or adoption, these things, one of the key things I hear parents say is, well, no, because I'm afraid if they're not thinking about this, then I'll just put the thought in their head. Well, there's the faulty assumption that they're probably not thinking about it already. And what I often find is kids are thinking about it, experience it, and interacting with it far before parents ever know what they're thinking about. How do we combat that? We know that we need to proactively shape the way our kids see life and reality, that we need to proactively talk about things and shape their worldview and shape how they think about things so they know Mom and Dad aren't afraid of talking about this. Mom and Dad have talked to us about this before. They have a way to avoid temptation. They have that escape if they know what is good and right, or they know Mom and Dad aren't afraid of talking to us about this. So let me give you some practical ideas of what I mean by this then. So foster godly disagreement. I'll just give you some examples of what we've done in our home or even what other families have done. But here's the freedom that as your family with your children, you know what they need, and you want to ask the Lord, what does it look like to engage them well? What are ways this child will open up, that they'll open up more with their siblings present, or they'll open up better with their siblings not present? All kinds of creative ways of thinking. We're known around the dining room table to always come up with funny, weird, to serious kind of conversations. And so one of the things we did really early on was I'll call it a game, I don't know if it's really a game, agree, disagree. And what we do is we come up with a statement like, secrets are bad, or secrets are good. And we would go around the table and say, agree or disagree. And we give our kids the freedom to agree with us or disagree, but they always had to say why. So what am I doing when I do that? I'm giving them the freedom to agree or disagree. I'm giving them the freedom to have their own thoughts and opinions, which is very important, by the way. Because what we tend to do is force compliance. And I do want my children to be obedient, but I also want to train them to be thoughtful, and I want to train them to think things through. So one goal is I actually want them to have their own opinion and feel free to disagree with me, but they also have to have a thought process behind it. They have to be willing to share what they think, and what we're doing is we're making them into thinkers, I hope. Because usually the conversations digress to whether Batman is a better superhero than Spider-Man, or whether pizza is better than raviolis. But here's what we're doing. We're fostering conversation, right? They're learning to agree or disagree. They're learning to be thoughtful. And it will be inevitable that it'll come back around and they are sharing some of their opinions because they've heard us share how to think. So an example is we let them do it. We'll let them have an agree, disagree, which is where usually Batman and Spider-Man and all kinds of things come in. And then we'll set the tone by saying keeping secrets is good or bad. Or there are times to lie to an adult. And we'll have a conversation like that. And what's helpful is they're all benefiting from hearing each other talk. You're benefiting by hearing what's going on in your child's process or their hearts. And sometimes I walk away going, wow, I'm really impressed with the way that child was thinking. And sometimes I walk away shaking my head going, oh my goodness, what are we doing wrong here? But we are capturing how our children are, and that's an entry gate into their life, and it's an entry gate into how they think and feel. It's really important for us. So fostering disagreement, agreeing and disagree. We also try to tell our kids that, you know what, you can disagree with us, but you need to do it respectfully. And as we all know, respect can be a hard issue when we're disagreeing. And how do you foster that? We also have, sticking with this theme, on our table we have I guess it's a plastic box, not glass, but plastic box, and it's called Table Topics. I highly encourage you guys that you can Google it on Amazon. Sometimes you see it in stores like Marshall's. It's called Table Topics, and it's this box where you pull out a topic and it just asks a question about life. And there's tons of games like that. There's tons of resources like it. We get one and we go through it several times until everybody's tired of the question, and then we go buy a new one. And our kids, we've got 5 teenagers in our home, they still ask to pull a table topic. You know why? Well, I should probably let them answer that for you, but I would hope one of it is because they enjoy talking. They enjoy thinking about things. We hopefully have fostered that they like sitting around and sharing their opinions and talking about things with us because there's been an environment created to do that. So whether, going back to Deuteronomy 6, right? Whether you sit, whether you rise, whether you're eating dinner, whether you're driving in the van, whatever you do, take every opportunity to talk with your kids. There's twofold. I get to speak into my children's lives, but I'm also developing the gift of hearing them and listening well to them. So there's probably dozens and dozens of other ways to do it, and one of the things I want to do is just spark your interest of saying, here's the kids God's given us, here's where they're at developmentally, here's their ages, here's the things that they're good at or not good at, and how do I help encourage them? Some kids aren't good at talking, or sometimes they're too shy or bashful. Well, in what ways do I learn to do that? Through drawing or coloring or games. I mean, there's all kinds of expressive activities you can do with your children that don't require the gift of being able to sit and talk. And as you know, some children are intimidated by that. So how can I build bridges? By coloring with them and fostering conversation, or by playing a card game with them. It is a lost art that we sit down and play with our children anymore. It's a lost art that families spend time together. And again, going back to some of those questions, or the questions that were laid up here on what kids wish parents knew, over and over we saw, I wish my parents spent more time with me. And my guess is you and I would be surprised by hearing that was our child say that, because either we think we do spend time with them, or we think they'd rather be on the Xbox or the Wii than talking to us, yet they want to be known. There's the issue. Kids need to build identity in really positive ways, and they want to be known. And do we take the time to really know them well?